I had an old professor who told me, whatever you do, don't let the program director put you on the program right after lunch. But I'm glad that everybody's been awakened by a really inspiring presentation, so do support the organization. It says that I'm supposed to discuss and review all clinical trials, past, present, and future. I'm not going to do that really, because there really aren't any adequately powered controlled clinical trials, RTCs as they're called, RCTs, for novel treatments of CRPS. And anybody in the audience know how much it costs to do an adequately powered controlled trial of a novel therapy for CRPS? Anybody know the price tag? Millions and millions. How many millions? 20. 40. 250. $250 million. Enough said. Okay. But RSDSA has been doing its part as best it can. We're a poor but honest 501c3. And since 1992, we've sponsored almost $2 million worth of research. Not all clinical research, thank you, yes. RSDSA, when I came into RSDSA, they were actively supporting research and in three basic areas: the mechanisms of disease, diagnosis and classification, and treatment. And early on, RSDSA sponsored model development, animal models mostly, whatever you might think about animal models, the neural mechanisms of disease, adrenergic mechanisms, and more recently, cytokines, autoimmune determinants, and epigenetic determinants. You might recognize those names as very popular fields of study for many diseases. In diagnosis and classification early on, we studied hypersensitivity and visceral pain, population studies of the incidence and prevalence of CRPS, which was one of the components that got CRPS classified as a rare disease. Pain perception and distortions of pain perception, as all of you may have experienced. Major histocompatibility correlates. The Budapest criteria for the diagnosis of CRPS. This was one of RSDSA's projects. Salivary gland oxidation products have been studied under our sponsorship. Recently, we have now programs studying a severity score to try and give a number to the severity of the disease, defining what recovery means so that we can study whether a treatment gives a CRPS sufferer what they would call recovery from their illness. A core data set for clinical research. This is a lot of the work that's being done by our colleagues in the UK with our support. And then we've also studied maternal mitochondrial determinants of CRPS. Recently, early on in treatment, we've studied surgical sympathectomy, and part of that research is why surgical sympathectomy is no longer a favored treatment. Transcranial stimulation was thought to be a good treatment option. We have sponsored studies. Nitroglycerin and evidence-based clinical practice guidelines were supported by RSDSA. Recently, we do have a clinical trial of low-dose naltrexone in process, nitrous oxide as an adjunct to opioid therapy to decrease opioid use. studies of induced sensory motor adaptation, and we worked on a consensus project trying to tease out a reference protocol out of the myriad protocols that are used for ketamine infusion. It's a highly variable field. Okay, let me see if I can get my next talk up. So what I'd like to talk with you about,
Research.
okay. What I'd like to talk to you briefly about is RSDSA's study of the long-term health effects of CRPS. Now, I put 20 years in quotes because it won't hit 20 years, and I'll explain to you why. So why did we do this? Well, people who have CRPS generally feel that it's not just about the pain, that conditions that appear to be unrelated to their painful condition don't feel as though they're unrelated. It all feels like one health condition. And my theory of this is that CRPS is an immune-mediated disease. I'm not alone in this. It's not a novel theory of mine. But immune impairments have global effects. And there are a lot of immune-mediated diseases. They number in the hundreds now. Here is a sample of them. Irritable bowel disease is neuroinflammation of the intrinsic control of the gut. Interstitial cystitis is neuroinflammation of the bladder. ALS and related degenerative diseases, some of them, are neuroinflammation of the motor apparatus. When I say motor apparatus, I mean that part of your nervous system that controls motor function. Multiple sclerosis is neuroinflammation of the myelin apparatus. That's the sheath around nerves that allows them to conduct properly. Fibromyalgia is neuroinflammation of the proprioceptive apparatus. The proprioceptive apparatus is what tells you where your body is in space. It's little nerves where muscles and tendons join bones and connect to each other that tells you perfectly out of awareness where your body is. So you can do this and you're not doing that. That's theoretical, by the way. No one's proven that it's neuroinflammation of the proprioceptive apparatus. Just a theory. And CRPS is neuroinflammation of the nociceptive apparatus. Nociception is the representation of a stimulus that produces or mimics tissue damage, the experience of which we call pain. I'm going to repeat that just so that that might not be a concept that everybody uses all the time. Nociception is the representation of a stimulus that produces or mimics tissue damage, the experience of which we call pain. So a family foundation came to RSDSA a long time ago now and said, we want to know what the long-term health effects of CRPS are, because it seems like a lot of things are related. that no one thinks are related, and we want to see if they are. And are they related to any particular type or sort of CRPS? And this was 3 weeks before their annual board meeting at which they would award money for research. So RSDSA had to come up with a research proposal and a research budget proposal in 3 weeks. Anybody here do clinical research or any kind of research, laboratory research? Yes, 3 weeks to produce a proposal for funding. We did it, and we got the funding. So we decided on an internet-based survey of an unselected sample of people with a diagnosis of CRPS, and we developed a 9-part questionnaire that the subjects were to complete annually for 20 years. And here's what we decided to add to that. It's a pretty big and arduous task. Is anyone here part of that study? Okay. I'm not going to say anything that should prejudice your final survey responses, and I wish I could say more about some of our results, but it's not finished yet, so I can't. That would prejudice subsequent surveys. Demographics: who you are, where you live, married, unmarried, working, not working. Family history of CRPS, spread and progression in your experience of CRPS, remission of CRPS. It's an odd phenomenon that perhaps somewhere up to 80% of people who have CRPS get over it. That's not represented in this room, I know, because you've all had it for much longer. But if you take a whole population and you study the incidence of CRPS, you're going to find a lot more people with CRPS than you ever thought had it, and they get over it. And what's the difference? Why do some people get over it in 6 months, a year, and others do not? And we don't know the answer. Pain experience, which includes the McGill Pain Questionnaire, you might know some of these instruments, and the Pain Disability Index, that's number 8. Review of Systems Checklist. It's a long checklist of heart, lung, gut, reproductive symptoms and signs. Medications: what medications does the person use? Care utilization: who do you see? Who treats you? How often? Profile of mood states is one of these instruments that measures anxiety and depression. Everybody, I'm talking to the choir here, or singing to the choir, or whatever that expression is. Everybody who has CRPS is deeply depressed by it and scared to death of it. Anxiety and depression, everybody has. You're not alone. So measuring that is a critical instrument in understanding the experience of CRPS. The Pain Disability Index I mentioned, and a quality of life measure that's pretty commonly used called the SF-36, short form 36 questions, obviously. And we contracted with a professional data management company that took our data from a secure, dedicated research website with good privacy assurance for their personal health information, and safety protocols, a red flag committee, so that certain questions would ring bells, particularly related to depression and suicidality. This is our study team. Kyoko Rice has been with the study from the very beginning, 10 years. She is our link to our respondents, our subjects in the study. She communicates with everybody on a regular basis, makes sure the data is good, and works with both the data management people and with the administration to make sure everything runs smoothly. She's invaluable. Jim Broach, you know, has been administering the study, and we now have a biostatistician working with us for very good reasons. And the best laid schemes, of mice and men, gang afterglay, you know that line from Robert Burns. Well, there is, here's my quip. There is no type nor sort of good idea that cannot be monetized to the benefit of the developer and for the exploitation of everyone else. And the data management company was bought out by some entrepreneurs who didn't have the resources or personnel to manage it properly. Our website disappeared, and we're now stuck with finishing the study with pencil and paper, which we're going to do. We're going to get we're going to round up all of our respondents and our subjects who've been so faithful in answering these questionnaires and get some final data. One of the reasons that we've decided to truncate this to a 10-year study is that I probably won't be alive when it would end otherwise, and it would be a line item in my will, and I'm not sure I could leave it to anybody. I shudder at the thought. But I think this is, in fact, the longest longitudinal study of CRPS that has been attempted. So we will have good information from it, and I'm hoping that we can let Kyoko Rice present our data to an international meeting in the future. So who responded? Well, mostly whom you'd expect, white women. Now, does this mean that there's a genetic predisposition to CRPS? Probably. We can't prove that yet, but it's probably the case. Here's the age distribution. This is very similar to the age distribution of people with CRPS that is published from other sources. So our population, our sample, is not different than the population as we know it. Where did it start? Lower extremity more than upper extremity. That's consistent with published data. Only 5% had a non-extremity CRPS at the outset. And the right side was more commonly affected than the left side. We hypothesize that this is the dominant side. 80% of people are right-handed and right-footed. And the dominant side is injured more easily than the non-dominant side. Almost half of our respondents reported an injury that precipitated their neurological abnormality that triggered their CRPS. 40% reported that the inciting event was surgery. How many people here had an inciting event that was a surgical procedure? A lot. Who first suggested CRPS? Well, appropriately enough, it was an orthopedic surgeon. If they did the work, it's good that they would recognize the complication, but that's not always the case. There are a lot of orthopedic surgeons who are faced with CRPS right up front, obvious CRPS, who can't recognize it. I'm sorry about that as an orthopedic surgeon, retired orthopedic surgeon. 3% of the respondents reported that their own research suggested CRPS. They found it themselves. How many people were the first to tell their doctors, do I have CRPS? Or ask their doctors? One couple in the audience, yes. Good for you. Be your own best advocate. You have to be. 87% reported spread of their CRPS. That is higher than in other reported samples. But that is indicative of the longevity of the CRPS among our respondents. We're not getting in our sample the people who have CRPS for a short period of time, get over it, and have some residuals. It's not a disease that disappears completely. You're never cured of CRPS. You can get it under control. You can cope and adapt to it. But it's not something that we understand as curable now. Let's be hopeful that the future holds something that looks like a cure. 42% reported that their CRPS spread more than a year after onset. So we're talking now about a disease that is reaching a chronic state, and is spreading as it does. So our cohort of respondents probably doesn't represent the population of people in the United States or anywhere who have CRPS. But it's an important subsample of this population of people with CRPS, and it's the most important in our view. So compared to that population-based cohorts that has been studied, our respondents had a lower incidence of remission, more spread, and reported less adequate pain control. But here's the good news, that even though the people in our study reported that the pain didn't improve that much over time, it did to some degree, they reported improved quality of life. I'm going to repeat that. They reported improved quality of life. And the take-home I get from that is that coping with CRPS and adapting to the experience of chronic pain is possible. And the stuff that you learn here, and from RSDSA, and from your support groups in your local communities, it works. And that's the good news, and I want to leave you with good news. Any questions? I have about 4 minutes.
So my question is, how many years are we into the study?
9. So we have 1 more year to get the final data, and we're going to get as many respondents who filled out long ago. There are over 1,800 respondents in this study, and we want to get as many long-term responses as possible. Not all of them are 10 years, of course, but we want to get as much data as we can.
Now another question over here.
You're next.
When you look at the criteria for diagnosing CRPS, how many doctors are aware of that criteria, and is it taught in medical school?
Good question. I can't answer that from our study. The question was of the diagnostic criteria, the Budapest criteria, or any of the published criteria, what proportion of physicians know about them? Are they taught in medical schools? The answer is that they are probably not taught in medical schools to the best of my knowledge. And I don't know, nod or shake your head, Jim, if there's any knowledge about the prevalence of physician understanding of the criteria for the diagnosis of CRPS.
I would say, Peter, 10 years ago, just before the study, we hired a consultant, went to 10 medical schools, and we asked 2 questions. And the first was, do you teach about CRPS? And uniformly, the answer was no. We asked, do you teach about pain within your curriculum? And one dean famously said to us, well, where do you want me to
Yes, I was just wondering, I completed that questionnaire and got a feedback that I would be getting additional things, but I've never gotten anything ever again. And so is there something that would have excluded people that completed it?
No, we'll rectify some of the communications. That was probably the website issue. That when our data management was sold and died, we had to take over communications. So that's probably the explanation, but I'll write to us at RSDSA and we'll pass that on to Kyoko and make sure anybody in the room who has at one time filled out one of these questionnaires, do get in touch with us so that we make sure that we follow up with you.
Hello, can you speak at all to the very recent neurogenic acid study, the clinical trial that was underway? Dr. Chopra mentioned this morning that the results were poor, but...
The neuridronate.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bone, it's an osteoclast inhibitor, so that it diminishes bone resorption, and bone resorption is a complication of CRPS. I was always skeptical about the osteoclast inhibitor efficacy because it's a downstream effect. And if you try and block a stream downstream from its origin, it's just going to flood around you. So I never really had a lot of faith in that. I apologize for seeming like I know it all, but I was always skeptical, and I don't know much more about it. All I know is that it was pulled from circulation because of a safety committee that looked at the results and said, no, this is not worthwhile.
I've had a kind of rare disease, multiple rare disease, and 12 years ago, when I was getting diagnosed with ankylosing spondylitis, a lot of internal medicine doctors didn't know what to do about it or how to deal with this. So I'm wondering if the RSDS is targeting the internal medicine doctor, because one of the things the AS organization had to do was trying to heavily educate the internal medicine doctor, because currently, as I'm dealing with the CRPS for the 6 months for the first time, internal medicine doctors are duly uneducated or not knowing what to do or don't even want to begin how to handle it, like an organization like UCLA and Cedars. So what kind of the efforts can we do, or is there any effort in place so that we could educate people how to help people like us from the beginning?
RSDSA's mission includes support, number one, education, advocacy, and research. But education is a big part of our mission. And you're absolutely right. AS, ankylosing spondylitis, is an inflammatory disease of the joints of the spine, the discs and the facet joints, mostly the discs. And it's another one of those immune-mediated disease. It's an inflammatory condition. And is it related to other inflammatory conditions like CRPS, AS and CRPS, both immune-mediated conditions? We don't know that yet. As far as the education piece is concerned, we have programs, we have continuing medical education programs that we distribute to healthcare practitioners at every level, from nurses, emergency room practitioners, internal medicine, anesthesiologists. It's a very limited enterprise in terms of reaching people, because you have to drag them into the continuing medical education program, get their attention, and keep them occupied while they learn something. And they have so many continuing medical education objectives and obligations that CRPS doesn't really get a lot of headway on this. So we are making efforts. One of the things we'd like to do is give an educational piece to each individual patient. So when you see an internal medicine doctor for the first time, or you see an emergency room physician for the first time, you can say, here's a letter from my personal physician. Here's a little blurb about CRPS and tells you something about the disease that I have. Here is a summary of some clinical practice guidelines that might help you to help me in our work over the next hour or so. And I think that's a more targeted type of educational program. But broad educational programs, I'm afraid we don't have the bandwidth for it.